However, we could move only at night. The thing is that just in February, March 1942, Hitlerites laid over the Partisan region transport air route to Damiens. There, as I have already written, their 16th Army was caught in a cauldron. It was cut off from the rear bases and therefore felt serious difficulties in supply. The only way out for the Nazis was to attract large forces of transport AVN, the creation of an air bridge to Damiansk, and aircraft engines began to roar over the edge. Almost every day, caravans of heavily laden vehicles were flying at a breakneck speed to the positions of the 16th Army, trying to alleviate its difficult situation. On the way to Damiansk, airplanes did not pay attention to anything extraneous. They would fly by as if they had not noticed. But on the way back, having completed the mission and freed themselves from the cargo, each Hitler crew considered it their duty to use up the ammunition on board, not neglecting even the smallest ground targets. Apparently, this was the attitude of Hitler's command, which sought to use all possible means to fight the partisans. Transport vehicles, of course, are not as well adapted to hit small targets on the ground as attack aircraft or fighters. Still, the Junkers, and these were machines of roughly the same size as our transport Lear 2, gave us a lot of trouble. They opened fire literally at everything alive that they saw on the ground, even at single carts, even at single pedestrians. Many civilians were killed in those days, and the partisans also suffered, though mostly not because they suffered losses, but because they were now forced to camouflage themselves particularly carefully. And then, as it often happened during the war, a new movement was born in the detachments, Hunters for Junker, and it could not be born because it is repugnant to the very spirit of the guerrilla to remain in the position of the game for which someone is hunting. The guerrilla used to hunt for the enemy. And gradually the picture changed. Our anti-aircraft gunners, armed with handheld machine guns and often simple rifles, learned to shoot down enemy vehicles and acted so effectively that Hitler's command was forced to change the route of the air route. Making a huge detour, Junkers began to fly to Damiansk, carefully bypassing the territory of the edge. But it did not happen at once. In those days, when our regiment made the transition from Belebelka to Polisto, German pilots were still in the air, and we had to hide from them. However, we did it quite successfully. We were recalled from Belebelka to participate together with the 1st and 3rd Regiments in the attack on the large enemy garrisons in the villages of Leno and Rushii near the southern border of the region. Before the Operation Vasiliv gathered the commanders, commissars and chiefs of staff of all 3 regiments and himself set us the task. Orlov, Majorov and Golovai were also present at this meeting. I remember to my first impressions of the commander was added that day this one. Nikolai Grigorievich had an amazing ability to combine in his voice absolute categorical and demanding with a completely incongruous at first glance with all this kindness and warmth. He gave orders firmly, leaving no doubt about the finality of his decisions and the indisputable necessity of their fulfillment, but at the same time it seemed that he was also making a request. Please try to do it well. He had a very attractive face. I would not call it handsome, nor would I use such commonly used definitions as strong-willed, stern, manly. Vasiliv was undoubtedly a man of courage, strong-willed, and he was sometimes harsh, but that was not what caught my eye. He had a very good smile. He could listen very attentively, sensitively, and, this is the main thing, kindly to any interlocutor, could understand others, and it was felt in his manner, facial expressions, look. I think that his charm was in his benevolence combined with the strength and confidence of this man. Brigade Commissar Sergei Alexeyevich Orlov was before the war the secretary of the Porkov District Party Committee, a member of the Leningrad Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks. In the photos he looks quite a military man, but I remember very well that no matter how hard he tried, he could not make anything like that. However, it was not bad at all. Moreover, it probably helped in his work, for the exemplary performance of which he, like Vasiliev, was awarded the highest order of the motherland. Vasiliv and Orlov complemented each other in many ways, and their joint activity deserved and deserves the highest praise. At that time, which I am now describing, their deeds were known not only in the Partisan region, but throughout the country. Hitler's headquarters also knew about them, and in the reports of Sovinform Bureau, quite often you could see reports about the successful actions of partisans under the command of comrades Vivai, and in those days our names were never mentioned openly. Newspapers at that time wrote as follows: Platoon Commander Comrade X killed 5 Hitler's robbers, or partisans under the command of Comrades V and O, Attacked at night the fascist garrison in one settlement. Comrade X is the hero of the Soviet Union Mikhail Karchenko. The garrison in one settlement is the 20th SS Battalion, defeated in the village of Yaski Didovichi district, and comrades V and O, Kombrig Vasiliev and Commissar Orlov. The meeting was coming to an end. Already finished setting up to conduct a raid. Vasiliev defined the issues of interaction between regiments, determined where, how, with what forces they will act. There were still small details, to the clarification of which I was going to go, and suddenly Vasiliev said, "No, Comrade Afanasiev, on the basis of everything you have heard, prepare an order for the brigade." At first I was confused. Why me? Flashed through my mind. Golovai is here. The others were also puzzled by this. It was the direct duty of the brigade chief of staff to prepare the draft order for the brigade, and there was no way that Golovai could not do it. More to the point, the order must have been prepared and signed long ago. I don't understand. But you will not ask about all this. Kombrig ordered, and I must fulfill. There is an order to prepare, I replied, standing up and meeting a glimpse of the obviously reassuring look of Golovaya. Permission to carry it out? Yes. Sit here and write, said Vasiliev, pointing to the table by the window. I found myself at the table, facing the window and with my back to those gathered. They continued to talk. Someone asked questions, someone answered, but I heard nothing, immersed in my perfectly natural why and even more in the drafting of the text. Finally, the draft was ready. I put aside my pencil and paper, listening to what was going on behind me. I ran my eyes over the text once more. Everything was in order. At that time, Vasiliev, Nikolai Ivanovich, are you ready? Ready, Comrade Kombrig. Vasiliev carefully read the document prepared a lot, handed it to Orlov, who, having read it, said, to Golovay. There are no remarks. The order was signed and read out to those present, and not a word more, as if it had always been like that, nothing. So then I didn't understand why Vasiliev had arranged this examination for me, nor did Skorodimov and Nazarov. True, on the way to the regiment, Skorodimov said, "Well, Kolya, you'll go far. I feel they will take you away from us." But it was more a joke than a statement of a man who knew something. And then there was no time to think about all this. We were preparing for a raid, then we fought a night battle in Leno and Rochika, and in this fight we almost completely destroyed both Hitler's garrisons. Again, we experienced the joy of victory and the bitterness of the loss of our comrades in arms. How many did not return again from the battle? But it was war. It was our work. And then I was called to the brigade headquarters. We left together with my adjutant Vasya Tsvetkov. He was one of the students of Partisan courses in Valdai. When I was assigned to Skorodomov's regiment, the commissar of the school, Alexander Petrovich Chaika, said that the adjutant would choose me himself. He did, and said that you couldn't find a better one, and he was absolutely right. To this day, some uninformed people believe that the adjutant, this is such a warmed-up at the headquarters and not smelling gunpowder man, or the military veiler, to serve the commander a pot of soup or warm water for shaving. But the adjutant is not a valet. He is the first assistant to the commander, his support and in battle, and however, whether it is worth a long explanation, you just need to look in the dictionary and read. A person of the officer's staff, a member of the commander for the performance of official assignments or staff duties. Setkov was a great comrade in arms. We passed next to him the whole military way and were wounded in one battle. One mine, and we were sent to the rear by one plane. But it was still a long way off, and while we were rolling in the wagons to the brigade headquarters, there was not a cloud in the sky. The sun was shining, and we were both in a good mood. Chasing the horse, Sidetkov, as usual, would drag out a song, or cut it short and begin another story about the misfortune of some of the partisans. Such program he always during your trips with him entertained both me and himself, I think. Even more because he rejoiced at each successful story he told as if he had not told it himself, but had just heard it for the first time. In short, there was no danger of boredom on the road. Vasya just started another tale, and then from behind the forest Messerschmitt, flying at an altitude of 30-40 meters, came straight at us. Without collusion, we grabbed our automatic rifles and opened fire on it, to no avail. In the meantime, the fighter paid no attention to us whatsoever. Apparently, the pilot had no time for us. He was in a hurry. Regretting our blunder, we drove on. I have already mentioned that in these days many people in the region were seized by the excitement of hunting German plans. They began to annoy us very much. I was not spared, since Hitler's machines flew over us very low, in a few tens of meters from the ground, and always approximately the same route. We could try to shoot them down with a ground explosion. I wanted to set a few landmines on the ground or place them on the tops of trees and explode the charges when the plane passes over them. The blast wave could shake the machine so violently that, losing control for a moment, it would crash into the ground. Unfortunately, I never managed to realize this idea. The regiment had absolutely no explosives at that time, and when they appeared, Hitler's pilots stopped flying over the edge as impudently as before. A conversation at the brigade headquarters was short but intense, and, for the umpteenth time, my fate changed abruptly. There were three of us, Vasiliev, Orlov, and myself. I was asked the very next day to take the 1st Regiment to ensure its participation in a joint operation of 3 regiments of the brigade against the enemy garrison in the village of Veriace, and then move to the extreme southwestern part of the Partisan region, in the area of further combat operations. Accepting the regiment was both difficult and easy. The fact that the age of the regiment was quite infantile, a little over a month, but during this time it had already managed to lose a Colonel M.Y. Yuri commanded for a week, and then suddenly fell ill and was sent to the Soviet rear. The rest of the time the duties of the commander were performed by the Chief of Staff of the regiment, Mikhail Viktorovich Stepanov, formerly a senior lieutenant of Voso troop. And there seemed to be a few cases accumulated, and there was no one to accept them. But the main difficulty was that there was almost no time left to get acquainted with my troops. The operation at Veriace was to begin at the end of the day following my arrival at the regiment. However, I decided that there is no harm without good. You can't get to know people better than in battle. True, I did not waste any time. I had a long talk with the Commissar, the former secretary of the Utogorkovsky District Party Committee, Alexander Ivanovich Kazakov, with the Chief of Staff. Both of them received me kindly, conscientiously introduced me to the regimental affairs, tried to help me in any way they could. There was, however, behind it and some weariness, but it is natural. They were also looking at me. Meanwhile, I tried to learn as much as possible about the fighters, about the commanders, about the relations in the regiment, about the established orders and habits. Many people came into the headquarters hut, everyone had some business, and I could observe much of what I was interested in. How the guerrillas were dressed, how they were armed, how they addressed their commanders, how they reacted to this or that order, what their mood was. In short, I was interested in everything, right down to the smallest thing, because even the smallest things, you never know, often turn into something very serious. The raid on Veriace was the end of a series of joint actions of 3 regiments of our brigade on the southern borders of the Partisan region. These actions forced the Nazis to withdraw to the area of Lake Tyarsevlo 25 kilometers east of the railway station Sashevo. The enemy suffered heavy losses in manpower and equipment, and most importantly, once again convinced of the increased activity and power of the guerrilla forces, in our determination and ability to resist punitive actions, in our ability to conduct serious combat operations, both in the territory of the region and beyond its borders. What happened in the winter of 1940 and 1942 on the fronts of the Great Patriotic War, near Tikhvin, Rostov, and especially, of course, near Moscow, Okavkalo in the deep German rear, including in the partisan forests of Pskov and Novgorod region. The myth of invincibility of Hitler's armies was turning into ashes literally before our eyes. People gained an amazing confidence. We became masters of the area conquered from the enemy and nowhere gave him a way out. About the Hitlerites and especially about their henchmen, policemen, headmen, and other traitors, one could say just the opposite. They began to tuck their tails. I remember one of the newspapers of that time, issued by the Germans for the inhabitants of the occupied territories. This newspaper was called Pravda. Hitler's propagandists stole not only the name, but also the appearance and even the title from our most authoritative newspaper. It was done for a reason. The fascists tried, using the familiar look of the newspaper, which the reader trusted, to cause trust to their child. But the child turned out to be a bastard. The content was so mediocre that it could make even a very unsophisticated person laugh. I do not recall, by the way, that Hitler's propagandists ever surprised us with an elaborate lie. They lied so shamelessly and ridiculously that one could simply replace any statement in their text with a negation and vice versa, and everything fell into place. The newspaper I remembered had a large picture on the front page. A German soldier leaning low against a snow-white snowdrift, carefully holding a stalk of grass that had broken through the snow in the palm of his hand. Basically, he lacked only a harp in his free hand and wings behind his back. By the way, the amazing sweetness of Hitler's propagandist's lies could cause nothing but bewilderment. I still don't understand what kind of readers they were counting on to listen to them. So it turned out, for example, that in Russian villages wehrmacht soldiers entered literally on tiptoe, so that God forbid not to disturb the afternoon sleep of a peaceful peasant, but who did not know the truth in those years. By the drawing, which I told about, Hitler writes, tried to convince the reader that what happened in winter is explained not by the strength of the Soviet soldier, not by the monolithic nature of our people, but by the severity and cruelty of the northern winter, the unaccustomed to the German troops. Millions of such green stalks will break through the thickness of snow, and that not only the inhabitants of the occupied territory. They tried to convince themselves of this, and to no avail. How could it be otherwise? Goebbels himself, the #1 ideologist in Nazi Germany, made just in those days, March 6, 1942, the following entry in his diary. The SD report informs about the situation in occupied Russia. It is even more unstable than everyone assumed. The danger from the partisans is growing every week. Partisans indiscriminately dominate over vast areas of occupied Russia. Of course, none of us thought that the enemy has already been defeated, that the victory over him dello the next few days. We realize that the fascists are still very strong. They can still cause our motherland great suffering. Their armies are still in Europe, and not so soon it will be possible to bleed them, to break them and drive them back, to Berlin. But no one doubted that now it was much closer. By the way, not only military success is determined by that time the state of our spirit. After all, how many changes had occurred even in the very way of life? We'd not feel our detachment at all. We had constant radio communication, received from the front line by airplanes many of the necessary things, and could always send our seriously wounded to the Soviet rear by air. The pilots of the air regiment, which served the partisans on the northwestern front, so mastered the air route to the partisan region that we were no less often than those who fought in the regular army units. Read the latest newspapers, received and sent letters. Probably everyone understands what a letter from home means for a soldier in war. Needless to say about the price of a letter that found its addressee in the enemy rear. As in turning to the raid on the garrison in Veriazhi, I will say that this battle was not marked by anything special. With the United Forces, we easily and quickly knocked out Hitlerites from the village, having made a lot of trouble. There was, however, an unfortunate mishap. The commander of one of the detachments lost his way on the march, wandered with his men through the woods and came to Veriazhi when the battle was already over. But, fortunately, it did not affect the outcome of the operation. He was very worried about his mistake. Besides, Stefanov and I, having analyzed the commander's actions on the march, were convinced that the cause of all the troubles is not a coincidence of circumstances, but the lack of basic ability to use a compass and map, a thing inadmissible. The offending commander was severely punished, and, to his credit, accepted our decision without a shadow of resentment or discontent. It was obvious that he himself could not and did not want to justify his ineptitude, and most importantly, he drew the right conclusions and asked for help in acquiring the necessary skills. In general, I had good impressions of the regiment's actions in this battle. The men were shot at, they acted competently, the battle management was well organized. In April it got noticeably warmer. The snow melted in the spring sun, became heavy from the melted water that soaked it, puddles glistened on the roads. And again it was a hot time for economic managers. Very soon it will be necessary to transfer the regiment to the summer uniform, and where to get it. Everyone has felt boots on their feet. You can't walk on puddles in them, and it is unknown what to replace them with. And, by the way, it was the boots that prevented in those days to conduct an operation, the success of which was not in doubt. We lived in the village of Salish, about 10 kilometers north of Lake Sevlo, the same one for which Hitler's garrison knocked out a Veriazhi left. He was stationed in a large village, called the same as the Lake Sevlo, and felt there, judging by the data of regimental intelligence, very calm. The village was far outside the partisan region, and this apparently seemed to Hitlerites a guarantee of safety, but no one forbade us to conduct operations outside the territory of the region. In addition, it was the pacification of the enemy promised a sure victory. We planned a night raid. At the appointed time, the detachments crossed the forest area and came to the lake, on the ice of which it was decided to move on. This way was until recently the only possible way. To go bypass along the shore was hindered by the lowlands overgrown with dense bushes and swamps that had already thoroughly thawed. The night frost only slightly seized their surface. Thin ice broke under the feet, and they immediately went into a liquid mess of water, mud and snow. And I repeat, our footwear was felt poop. We went out on the lake ice, and then it turned out that this way was also inaccessible for us. The ice was still strong, but the thaw had covered all its surface under the snow with a thick layer of water, and in just a few minutes our feet were wet through. On the lake we had to walk about 3 kilometers, then fight, then return the same way. It is clear that in battle there are possible losses, but how many men will lie down sick after marching through icy water there and back? And if frost strikes in the morning, a common thing, how many people will freeze their feet? And won't it turn out in the end that we will disperse the Nazis and Seblo, but the regiment will lose its fighting ability? In short, as unfortunate as it was, I gave the order to cancel the operation and return. That same night we had a meeting that started the events that were not quite ordinary. We returned to Silesium and began to move into the huts, those, of course, in which we had lived before the operation. Having given the last orders, I, together with Kazakov and Stepanov, went to the hut where the headquarters used to be. Vasya Tetsvetkov was waiting for us at the entrance, but he looked a little worried. "They occupied our hut, comrade commander," he said, himself surprised at such news. "And who? I have no idea." We entered the house. It was dark, and I turned on my pocket light. Its beam jumped across the floor, revealing the bodies of 25 men sleeping on the bed of straw, all in identical T-shirts, all of them young, strong, muscular. The indignation I had felt at the first moment faded away by itself. The sight of these guys sleeping sweetly, even in your own place, was surprisingly pleasant. I thought, I wish we had more of them in the regiment. Then I paid attention to the neatly arranged weapons of the detachment by the walls. It too could make anyone envious, because it turned out that for every 2 soldiers they had 1 handheld machine gun and 1 automatic rifle. A little embarrassed, however, carelessness of the commander of this group. Is it possible even in the territory of the region to camp for the night without setting up a guard? What if not we, but Hitlerites would enter the village? However, I decided not to wake up the detachment and went with the headquarters to a neighboring free hut. Sevkov, however, ordered to find out who the senior of these guys and bring him to me. Soon in front of me stood, as strong as all the others in his group, a guy in an army uniform without insignia and hoarse from sleep voice, but clearly in a military way reported. The commander of the detachment, Senior Sergeant Bushnev. He introduced himself. Then it turned out that the detachment is staffed on the Kalinin front and consists entirely of servicemen sergeants. Having fulfilled the task in the occupied territory of the Kalinin region, in the area of the railroad station Toropets, went to the Partisan region. Now, after arrest, he is going on a mission outside the region in Bezhenitsky district. Having inquired about the armament, I learned that indeed in the detachment for every 2 fighters, a handheld machine gun and an automatic rifle. In addition, the detachment has such a number of horses and wagons, which makes it extremely maneuverable and fast. All this made us think, can we not adopt such an experience? After all, if you create in our regiment similar strike groups, you can get a solid effect. It was only confusing that automatic weapons are surprisingly voracious on ammunition, with which the guerrillas almost always had difficulties. Early in the morning, Bushnev's men settled on a sled and very quickly melted into the pre-dawn gloom, and at noon I received a radiogram from the brigade headquarters signed by Vasiliev. It was addressed to all commanders and commissars of regiments, detachments and other units operating independently in the region. It was an order in case of a meeting with Bushnev's detachment to immediately disarm the entire group, arrest Bushnev together with his commissar, and take them both under escort to the brigade headquarters. A mass of questions swirled in my head. Bushnev didn't arouse any suspicion in me, but you don't just give arrest orders, so what does that mean? Why should the squad be disarmed? If these men are dangerous, how dangerous are they? Wouldn't it be necessary to use weapons against them if the chance brings us together again? But none of these questions was answered by the radiogram. The only thing that calmed down to some extent was that there was no question of arresting the soldiers of the squad. They only had to be disarmed. So, no, still a lot of unclear. However, he immediately radioed to the headquarters about the recent meeting with Bushnev and about his readiness to strictly execute the order in case of his appearance. And a few days later, Bushnev's detachment was again in the territory controlled by the regiment. We had to act. Intelligence reported that the detachment had settled down to rest in the village of Marinai, 15 kilometers away from us. I ordered Alexei Ivanovich Pushkin, an authorized officer of the special department, to go to Bushnev and ask him to come to the regimental headquarters. Soon Bushnev, together with his commissar, was at my place, and his detachment was stationed in the street in front of the headquarters hut, knowing nothing, but evidently suspecting something wrong. Bushnev, too, was alarmed, but tried to keep calm. In preparing for this meeting, I was most afraid of a direct armed clash. Who knows for what sins Bushnev was to be arrested, and it was possible that he had nothing to lose. Of course, this detachment, in spite of its strong armament, would not be able to resist a whole regiment, but there would be casualties. We must try to accomplish the task without using weapons, and I took all precautions. I decided to talk to Bushnev and his commissar face to face. Even before their arrival, I took off all my weapons and put them, as if by accident, in plain sight and away from the table where I was sitting. True, I ordered Savetov to stand outside the door with a machine gun, and in case of complications to shoot at his feet. And now there were 3 of us in the room, and Bushnev's detachment was buzzing under the windows. I was sitting at the table, and Bushnev and the commissar were standing about 5 paces from me, for I had not asked them to sit down. Calmly, as if it were something mundane and insignificant, I have received an order from the brigade headquarters to arrest you, and I saw Bushnev tense up and his hand rest on his automatic rifle. Turning my head to the window, I slowly stood up, looked at the street for a few seconds, pausing, and only then turned my gaze to the men standing in front of me. I wanted them to notice that I was unarmed. Apparently it happened. I caught Bushnev's glance at my automatic rifle in the far corner and at my belt with the pistol grip sticking out of the holster lying next to it on the bench. Bushnev calmed down somewhat. Your detachment has been ordered to disarm. As a military man, you realize, of course, that this order will be carried out. I suggest that you are the first to surrender your weapons. There was silence in the hut, broken only by the clock on the wall, which swung the pendulum with characteristic clicks. Bushnev suddenly exploded. And for what? He almost shouted. Why should I arrest you, do you know? I don't know, I interrupted him. There's nothing about it in the order. So what's the point? You don't have to shout anyway. Then the commissar entered the conversation. It's a mistake, comrade commander. He muttered. We came straight from the battle. We gave the Krauts a hell of a beating. Maybe it's not about... He spoke quite convincingly, and yet I felt that both men standing in front of me knew some guilt, but only what kind, I could not even guess. There can be no mistake. It is Sid, Bushnev's detachment. There was a pause again. It seemed to me that it lasted too long, but I didn't want to press it yet. I gave Bushnev time to think. I could see that he was not going to grab the machine gun, but he obviously didn't want to obey either. He was thinking something over in his mind, though he couldn't come to a final decision. And if I don't obey, it's not clear who arrested whom. He nodded at the window. These are my men. I shrugged. Do you really think, Bushnev, that I'm such a simpleton? It was you who could remember to go to bed without setting up a guard. I don't allow myself such a thing. At our first meeting I had not mentioned his carelessness, and now, quite unexpectedly, he seemed to be being taught a lesson, and just when he had assumed an independent posture, I took advantage of his confusion and continued. And then think, can you manage a whole regiment? It is not serious. And then the peaceful flow of our conversation was suddenly broken. In the hut, pushing away with his shoulder, Tsvetkov, who did not have time to react, burst a big brute with a handheld machine gun and shouted from the threshold. What's going on here? It was one of the fighters of Bushnev's squad. The atmosphere became heated. I felt that now, if not this guy, then Vasya would open fire, and then it was all over. Without raising my voice, slowly but very firmly and irritably, I said to Bushnev, Shetams, comrade commander, Order your fighter to get out and immediately, and then punish him for violating the regulations. What kind of sergeant do you have who doesn't know how to address the regiment commander? Well, do it! Well, go. Bushnev muttered to the boy. Go. And he, sour from such a turn of events, went out. Now put your weapons on the table. I was already openly commanding. Bushnev looked at his commissar, and the first shown from his neck automatic took out of the holster a pistol, and from the sheath a short cleaver with a wide blade, and put it all in front of me. The commissar followed his example. It is difficult to surprise a partisan with the kind of weapons he carries. Almost every one of us had, in addition to what we were all issued, a trophy pistol, some elaborate dagger, or something else of that sort. But Bushnev and his commissar had a whole arsenal on them. When Tizvitkov came up to search them, more pistols and knives began to appear from behind the shin of their boots, from the pocket of their pants, from behind their belts, from the pocket of their fur coat. Vasya only shook his head. I must say that all the soldiers of the detachment were armed in the same way, and that is probably why it was especially difficult to persuade them to hand over their weapons. They did not believe that they would get back everything they had handed over. When I announced the arrest of their commander and commissar, and that I had an order to disarm the whole unit, they hummed for a long time, as if at a rally. It was felt that it would not come to a clash, but it was difficult to end in peace. The unit was buzzing not only because it was being disarmed, but also because they wanted to take from the soldiers what they had gained in the battle. It may seem strange to some, but it was the trophy weapons that they did not want to give up. The rest, please, but this, no way. In the end, I had to give my commander's word that as soon as the brigade had sorted everything out and authorized it, everyone would get back everything, down to the last cartridge. Everyone tied their weapons and ammunition in a bale, put it all together and locked it in the summer half of the headquarters hut and posted a sentry. I kept the key. Maybe the soldiers of the detachment were calmed down by the fact that I told them about my intention to apply for inclusion of their detachment in the regiment. In short, we got along well. Sergeyev and his commissar were sent to the brigade headquarters. My request regarding the further fate of the detachment was quickly satisfied by Vasiliev, and 3 days later Bushnev himself and his commissar returned to the regiment. By this time we already knew the reason for their arrest. The fact is that the detachment on arrival in the Partisan region was included by order of the brigade in one of the regiments based to the north of us, but Bushnev did not like it there. He said that it was all about the inactivity of this regiment, and in my opinion just did not like to obey and wanted independence. In short, he and the commissar arbitrarily raised a detachment and went to fight in Beshanitsky district. It must be said that they were very successful there. They defeated 2 Volost administrations, dispersed several police detachments, and then the detachment returned to the region. The rest is known. At the brigade headquarters, Bushnev was given a beating, but he was not demoted to private, and he returned to the detachment. This was the end of the incident, which had been an exciting mystery for us for several days. I told about it not for the sake of a red word. The concept of military discipline is known to many people today, but those who did not fight, it is difficult to understand what it consisted of in those years, not only from high consciousness and self-organization of people. Discipline was also born of strictness, sometimes brought to its extreme manifestations. The example with Bushnev is not an extreme, and yet Locke, he did not desert, did not go to his mother-in-law for pancakes, but went to fight the enemy, but was nevertheless arrested. And you must agree Vasiliev's actions were absolutely correct. He could not tolerate what is called partisanship, could not stand this kind of freedom and self-determination. And the 2nd Brigade was therefore a very organized unit. Partisanship was fought here with determination and vigor. In mid-April I received an order to redeploy the regiment to the north. The route was specified, through Ukoshino, Glotovo, Serbolovo, Nivki, Ginilitsi to the area of the village of Bolshoi Zapoli. The crossing was to be long and difficult, about 100 kilometers. True, it was possible to try to pass straight. It would be only 30 kilometers, but the bogs on the way had already thawed, and our men were still in felt boots. We moved in the dark, only now not because we were afraid of Hitler's aviation. At night it was freezing, and it became drier. We reached the 3rd day. The headquarters of the regiment was located in a completely empty village, Trestyanka. The inhabitants had left it before the war. Who moved to Leningrad? Who moved to other villages? There was only one person living in the whole village of Trestyanka by the time we arrived, Nearby, in the village of Gorodovik, was the headquarters of the 2nd Regiment. So in the new district we had neighbours, and also well equipped. These days the brigade had grown noticeably. Quite a few guys in the villages wanted to join the Partisans, and we were allowed to accept volunteers into our units. We settled into the new place, received replenishments, conducted reconnaissance. The regiment was still dressed in winter, and in the meantime spring was eating away the last of the snow. My deputy on the economic part, Alexei Dmitrievich Sarichev, visited the brigade headquarters, and there helped as much as they could. Airplanes transferred summer uniforms and shoes from the Soviet rear, but there was still not enough for all regiments, and we had to look for a way out of the situation, and there could be only we, and to take what we needed from the enemy. Just at that time, we were preparing an operation against 3 enemy garrisons located nearby. It was supposed to hit them simultaneously. The detachment Brave attacked the Hitlerites in the village of Belkova and Sedov's detachment in Dudino and Dru. In case of retreat of enemy units, 2 ambushes were organized by Bushnev's detachment on the road between Dudino and Belkova, and by the detachment Brave on the road to Chikaivo between Dudino and Spiridonkino. This operation went remarkably smoothly and brought quick success. When exactly at 2 o'clock in the morning in Belkova, Dudino and Drusino hit partisan rifles, machine guns, the Hitlerites, caught by surprise, could not organize any response. All 3 garrisons were destroyed in a matter of minutes, and the morning to the headquarters of the regiment brought abundant trophies, including a lot of clothes and shoes. A few days later, together with the 2nd Regiment, we conducted a night raid on the peninsula Plotovets, familiar to me from the first entry into the enemy rear in the summer of 1941. Again, our actions were swift and unexpected, and again the Nazis could not organize any resistance. In less than an hour after the beginning of the raid, we left Plotovets, leaving the station in the most deplorable condition. The railroad bed was blown up in several places. A large section of the telephone and telegraph communication line was cut out. The entire switch house was blown. The station building was destroyed. The railroad bridge was blown up. And, of course, again trophies, among which, as before, uniforms and shoes were of special value. May 1 was approaching, and just like in the days of peace, everyone was in high spirits. It was pleasant even just to say aloud the word May Day, and it is understandable. Any of us was carried away by thoughts back to the past, and it was seen by all cloudless and happy. There rattled the brass of festive orchestras, moved motley columns of demonstrations, flags fluttered in the wind, people laughed joyfully. There was peace, and what a wildness, what a terrible absurdity the war began to seem, a mad fiction of bastards who got to the state power, who ordered the fate of entire nations so primordially savage. Hatred for fascism entered the hearts of people together with this word, war. The hatred was huge, but it had no limit, because it grew with every hour, grew until that May Day of the 45th year, in honor of which salutes are rumbling today and on the way to which there are mounds of graves and granite monuments. In the days before May, our regiment grew a lot, first of all due to the replenishment from local youth, about which I have already written. We accepted new comrades into our ranks solemnly and strictly in a soldierly manner, and before the formation of detachments sounded the words of the partisan oath, "Here they are." I, the son of the great Soviet people, voluntarily joining the ranks of partisans of the Leningrad region, I give before the face of my fatherland, before the workers of the heroic city of Lenin, my sacred and inviolable oath of a partisan. I swear to be faithful to my motherland until my last breath, not to let go of my arms until the last fascist invader will not be destroyed on the land of my grandfathers and fathers. I swear to keep sacred in my heart the revolutionary and martial traditions of the Leningraders, and always be a brave and disciplined partisan, despising danger and death. I swear with all my strength, with all my skills and thoughts, to selflessly and courageously help the Red Army to liberate the city of Lenin from the enemy blockade, to clear all the towns and villages of the Leningrad region from the German invaders. For the burned towns and villages, for the death of our women and children, for the torture, violence, and abuse of my people, I swear to avenge the enemy cruelly, mercilessly, and relentlessly. Blood for blood and death for death. I vow to tirelessly unite in partisan detachments behind enemy lines all honest Soviet people from small to great, to relentlessly beat the fascist bastards with everything that the hands of a patriot can beat with: an automatic rifle and a rifle, a grenade and an axe, a scythe and a crowbar. a stake and a stone. If by my cowardice or malice I break this oath of mine, and betray the interests of the workers of the city of Lenin and of my fatherland, let the retribution for this be the universal hatred and contempt of the people, to the curse of my relatives and a shameful death at the hands of my comrades. Our recruits did not know what a young fighter's course. They went straight into battle with only one grenade in their hands, and they got their weapons in a fight. It was a cruel test for them, but many had to pass it. There were not enough weapons for everyone. And for one more reason the regiment grew. It was temporarily attached to 3 detachments of Latvian partisans who arrived in the region to master the tactics and methods of fighting behind enemy lines. These detachments, the total number of which amounted to 280 people, were composed of well-trained military men who had already been to the front, but they had no partisan experience at all. That is why they found themselves in the region, which at that time, as I have already said, was considered a kind of academy. Latvian detachments were trained in Valdai, at the very partisan courses which I had the opportunity to lead. They were trained under the commanders from the first graduating class, A.R. Valentsev, G.M. Zhuravlev, and Esmashk. Together with reflections, they came to the region and continued to teach their Latvian comrades in a combat situation. Sometime later, Valentsev became my deputy in intelligence, and Zhuravlev, the commander of the detachment Kim. At the leadership of the Latvian detachments were 3 prominent revolutionaries, Ernest Samarik, Peter Spraidis, and Ogamars Oshkolms. These were men of bright destinies, true revolutionaries, true patriots. Each of them was an outstanding and interesting personality, and we could tell a lot about each of them. More than with the others, I got along with Otomar Petrovich Oskal, an extremely sociable and kind man. He was in his 40s, and he knew what it was like to be arrested and imprisoned in a concentration camp for revolutionary activity. He was a teacher by profession, and it is safe to say that he was a good teacher. His high education, his ability to get in touch with people, his excellent skill as a storyteller, his poise and strong will testified to that. In combat operations, he held himself as if he had not been engaged in anything else but guerrilla warfare since childhood. He was a very brave man, but never lost his head, and in recklessness to reproach him was impossible. All this, taken together, could not but create a strong and deserved authority for him. After the overthrow of the bourgeois regime in Latvia in 1940, Oshkalns was a deputy of the People's Simias and then of the Supreme Soviet of the Republic. The war forced him to take in Latvia on the organization of the partisan movement, Commissar and then commander of a partisan brigade. In the days of our acquaintance, his combat path was just beginning. And how many surprises were on this. I remember, for example, with what heartache he told later about one of the battles, which was fought by his detachment already on the border with Latvia, on the way from the partisan region to his homeland. The thing is that among the police officers who attacked the detachment, Oshkaln recognized several of his former students. How could they, so kind, sympathetic and fair in their childhood, in a few years find themselves on the other side of the barricades, in the same camp with the enemies of their people, in the same camp with the fascists, who were able to arouse the only feeling in any normal person, hatred? How could they shoot their teacher? Oshkaln could not understand it, and this is what struck me then. He ended his story not by lamenting the betrayal, not by rebuking or threatening. He suddenly said, "No, so I did something wrong, so I didn't teach them well." To seek very characteristic of him. To seek first of all his own fault, however insignificant it might be, next to the fault of others. Ernest Samarik was the oldest among our guests. He had long since passed 40, but he looked young, energetic, trim, not a gram of extra weight. He had a brilliant past as a professional revolutionary. Participation in the Civil War, years in the underground, penal servitude, work in the Comintern. He was able to talk about all this in an extremely interesting way, but he almost never spoke about his personal merits or about the hardships that fell to his share. This was one of his most characteristic features, striking in such an eventful biography modesty. There was not even a hint of self-centeredness, narcissism or self-love in him, but there was a lot of sincerity, simplicity, cordiality. He easily got along with people. Everyone knew him. Everyone respected him. I remember Peter Yanovich Bredis as a less sociable, to some extent even withdrawn person. Probably that's why I knew him less than others, but even a brief acquaintance was enough to guess in him a firm character, great persistence. His reticence was explained. in my opinion, by the fact that Bredes was a man very modest, even. He was also a former party worker revolutionary. He also knew what prisons and penal servitude were like. The government of bourgeois Latvia kept him in prison for almost 7 years. After the restoration of Soviet power in the Republic, Bredes held the post of secretary of the District Party Committee, was chairman of the People's Seimas, later the Supreme Soviet of the Latvian SSR. I remember how these three men surprised me literally on the second day of their appearance at the regiment headquarters. We treated them as guests, so we had not assigned any duties to any of them yet, and here Bredes came to me with a request. Permission, Comrade Commander, we will carry the guard of the headquarters. I already knew what kind of people they were. I knew that their real purpose was much more serious than to stand with a machine gun at the entrance to the headquarters hut, and probably that's why I was confused for a moment and didn't answer at once. But Bredes, taking my silence for a refusal, began to assure me fervently that all of them would be able to cope with the duties of sentries perfectly well. I did not let them go on guard duty. Instead, I ordered to immediately include them in active staff work, and my respect for these people very much strengthened. Notice, the more insignificant a man, the more often he is dissatisfied with the vicissitudes of fate, and vice versa. The more worthy a man, the less he sees around him small and unnecessary things. He will take up any of them, just to be useful. The regiment now controlled quite a vast territory. The brave detachment alone occupied several villages at one. In Belkova, its headquarters was located in Nikoskoye, Dudino, and Drusino, the main forces, and on the approaches to Chikachevo, reconnaissance groups. In the village of Bolshoy Zapoli, 3 Latvian detachments were stationed. In Jelevet stood Bushnev's detachment. Other detachments occupied nearby villages. The regiment became a significant force, with up to 800 men in its ranks. In 1941 and 1942, Chikachevo was truly a hornet's nest of punishers. From here came out the vast majority of groups and detachments that acted against us in winter. From here Hitler's spies tried to penetrate into the region. Now Chikachevo was under constant observation of our scouts, and any dangerous actions, any movements of the enemy in our direction quickly became known to the regimental headquarters. Data and information extracted by the scouts testified to the impending attack on the Partisan region. Everything said that this attack should be expected from day to day. In those days, we carried out a series of actions, which later became known as political reconnaissance and decomposition of the enemy's forces. Our scouts began to spread rumors among the inhabitants of villages outside the region that the partisans were now stronger than ever, that they had received very powerful armaments, and that large units of the Red Army, equipped with the latest military equipment, were now in the Partisan region. We expected that rumors of this will certainly reach the Nazis, cause wariness, exacerbate the already strong sense of fear of the guerrillas. Our assumptions that the attack should be expected precisely from the direction of Chikachevo confirmed, and this greatly facilitated the task of defending the borders of the region. True, we were somewhat mistaken in the timing. The second punitive expedition was launched somewhat later than we had anticipated, but this was explained, apparently, by the fact that we managed to misinform the enemy. So, by the way, this was also the reason for the exceptional, completely uncharacteristic for the Punishers' earlier cautiousness with which they began their second expedition. The Nazis launched an attack on the edge from the direction of Chikachevo, not only because they were accustomed to operate from here. The thing is that in this area began the road leading to Stara Russa, where was still in the bag stubbornly resisting Demian grouping of the Wehrmacht. Its supply was carried out by air, so the road Chikachevo, Stara Russa, although very heavy, could be in the hands of the enemy, could change a lot in his favor. The capture of the northern highway controlled by partisans, and was in fact the goal of the second punitive expedition of the Nazis. Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor UIP, Petrov writes about it as follows. Due to the increased intensity of fighting, which was conducted by the 16th Army, and the desire to preserve and maximally strengthen it, Hitler's command, naturally, wanted to have in the rear of this army the necessary network of railroad and highway communications. Supplying the 16th Army by air because of heavy losses in airplanes could not last long. As the railway and highway Dino Staraya Russa could not cope with transportation, the Nazis organized a transshipment base at the station Chikachevo. From here, all military cargoes and replenishments for the 16th Army had to follow the highway. An additional transshipment base was also created at the station Didovici, from which also ran an auxiliary highway to the main road Tkachevo, Staraya Russa. However, the use of existing communications and the creation of new ones was strongly hindered by the partisans who had fortified themselves in the Partisan region. It must be said that the situation in the troops of Army Group North by this time again stabilized. Attempts to deblock Leningrad undertaken by the Red Army in January-April 1942 were Moreover, in the Novgorod area, our Second Shock Army was caught in a cauldron, the situation of which was worsening every day. On the outskirts of Leningrad was transferred several fresh divisions of the Wehrmacht. The Nazis were preparing for a new assault on the heroically defended city. In the implementation of the overall plan to seize Leningrad, a significant role was called to play, and the 16th Army of the enemy. However, the army's actions were constantly hindered by the guerrilla movement, which was actively developing in its rear. It diverted more and more forces. Its partisan movement in the rear of Army Group North was becoming more and more powerful. In the partisan region was no longer 1 2nd Brigade, but as many as 4, the 1st Special, 2nd, 4th and 5th LPB. Their total strength was on May 1, 1942, 95 people. Operational management of all guerrilla forces operating in the region was carried out by the command of the 2nd LPB, and strikes against the enemy became more and more tangible, and the control of the territory occupied by the guerrillas more and more rigid. Example, the same Northern Highway. In the end, Hitler's command handed over the leadership of the fight against the partisans in the hands of the Wehrmacht. This entailed the involvement of field and even special troops in the actions against us. In the Second Punitive Expedition, for example, in addition to security units participated in the forces of the 290th Infantry Division, supported by artillery, tanks and aircraft, to replace the Commander-in-Chief of Army Group North Field Marshal von Lieb. Colonel General von Kuchler had a sufficient understanding of the dangers of the guerrilla movement. He was characterized by a particular cruelty of methods of suppression of the popular struggle. It was on his orders that villages in the zone of action of our units were brutally destroyed together with the inhabitants caught in them, regardless of their age and sex. He decided to destroy the partisan region at all costs, and he did not disdain anything. For centralized action against the guerrillas was created a special corps of 207th, 285th and 281st Guard divisions with a special 107th Infantry Regiment attached to it. On von Kuchler's instructions, more and more new punitive police units were created in the Leningrad region, as well as false guerrilla units formed from traitors and split. In fact, they were whole units of provocateurs who, pretending to be partisans, sought to identify underground organizations and groups to obtain information about the location of our bases, about the dislocation of partisan forces. Their military actions were reduced, as a rule, to mass shootings of civilians who sympathized with the guerrillas and abuse of their families. Where it did not come to shootings and was limited to looting and violence, they restored the inhabitants against us because they did not even realize that it was not the partisans who had visited the village, but the enemy disguised as them. On the 3rd and at the beginning of May was not pleasant. On the 3rd and 5th it snowed. It was unusually wet and cold. Nevertheless, everyone was in a good mood. We celebrated May Day well and cheerfully. On April 30, a delegation returned to the region, which had accompanied a convoy of food supplies to Leningrad. Leningraders sent us many presents for the holiday: machine guns, pistols, binoculars, harmonicas, gramophones, cameras, and the political department of the front, several movies. Shkir, Shores, Pugachev, Pez. In these days I got the joyful news. By the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on April 3, 1942, my younger brother, Lieutenant Baltese Alexei Ivanovich Afanasyev, commander of a torpedo boat, was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for exemplary performance of combat missions of the command at the front of the fight against the German invaders and the valor and courage shown in doing so. On the night of May 3, now together with the 3rd Regiment, commanded by Nikolai Alexandrovich Rachkov, we conducted a night raid on the enemy garrisons located in the villages of Dorozhkino, and, at the same time, partisans of the 1st Brigade under the command of Nikita Petrovich Bushnev attacked enemy garrisons in the villages of Risi and Degyerevo. All these garrisons were on the northwestern border of the partisan region, and from this direction, as well as from the southwest, according to all reports, was preparing to attack us. The night was dark. Low, heavy clouds covered the sky, hid the moon, and the exit to the initial positions of the attack could be carried out unnoticed by the enemy, and yet Hitlerites, though caught by surprise, were able to organize defense and soon from well-prepared positions led a frantic return fire. First machine gun fire, and then dense artillery. Our regiments were not tasked with capturing the attacked villages. The purpose of the raid was to inflict maximum damage to the enemy. Therefore, Rachkov and I, seeing that the battle turned gradually into a positional, decided to stop fighting. From the command post rockets flew up, signaling the withdrawal from the battle. Our fighters slowly withdrew to the woods, and soon we were on our way back. But until the morning we could hear the Germans pouring fire on the approaches to their positions, fearing a second attack. This battle was not long, but the enemy lost over 100 men killed and wounded, 3 automatic guns and 18 firing points. Due to timely withdrawal from the skirmish, our losses were insignificant. Vasiliev arrived at the regimental headquarters. He visited the detachments, familiarized himself with the staff work. He made some remarks, but it was obvious that he was satisfied with the regiment. Before leaving, he warned that, according to the brigade intelligence, the attack of the Punishers from the direction of Chikachevo should be expected from one day to the next. The regiment must be in constant readiness. And do not count on help, said the brigade commander. Act on your own. You have enough forces. After Combrig's departure, our neighbour, the 2nd Regiment, withdrew and went to a new area. It was to take the defence on the northwestern border of the Edge, from where they were also waiting for a blow. We were not only preparing to meet the Punishers, but also continued our usual combat operations. Just in these days, 2 of our sabotage groups conducted the first daytime raids on the railroad. On May 8, a group of Bushnev's detachment destroyed a repair and recovery train near the village of Batkovo, along with its entire crew of about 50 men, and the next day 26 partisans from the detachment for the motherland, about 5 kilometers from Chikachevo, fired on a moving train. Here is an excerpt from a combat report. Almost at point-blank range, the partisans opened fire on the enemy train. The Germans were so stunned that they did not fire a single shot until they had moved half a kilometer away from the place of ambush. The group of partisans fired mainly at the class wagons, which were riddled with machine gun bursts. We believe that the enemy suffered heavy losses. These were the last of our diversions on the eve of the punitive expedition. Already on May 9, by forces of a detachment of 100 people, the Hitlerites conducted a reconnaissance by combat. They tried to capture Nikolskoe, but, met by our barricades, withdrew. Now it was necessary to wait for a blow of the main forces. On May 11 at 7 o'clock in the morning, in the area of location of the detachment, Brave and intensive firefight started. It was led by the observation post Brave, located in the village of Spiridonkino, and the enemy detachment of 25 to 30 people who managed to get to the post stealthily, surround it, and unexpectedly attack. The enemy was clearly trying to get a tongue. Shame the post, caught in an extremely difficult situation, fiercely shot back. But the Nazis achieved their goal. When the reinforcements from Brave came to the place of battle, everything was already over. Having captured 2 partisans, the attackers had time to withdraw to Chikachevo. It is clear that all this was fraught with the most serious consequences. The order in case of an attack by the Punishers was prepared long ago, back in April, and known in all detachments. Now it was necessary to correct it urgently. Considering that from the captured partisans Hitlerites could learn something, we did it in time. The regiment took the defence, and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the approaches to Duno and Racino showed more than 1,000 troops column. The second punitive expedition began. The tactics of our actions in the initial period was determined by the following considerations. For a long time we could not provide effective frontal resistance to the enemy, who greatly surpassed us in strength, but strong and unexpected blows on the rear of the advancing, and at the same time flank attacks from ambushes could bring success. The regimental headquarters moved to the village of Belkova, directly to the battlefield. The headquarters of the Brave moved respectively to the area of Dudino and Racino. Latvian detachments took the defence of Bolsho-Zapolia, Sedov and Bushnev detachments, prepared for flank attacks. The detachment for the motherland remained in reserve. The first to enter the battle was the barrier of the detachment Brave. The head part of the column of Punishers was forced, having delayed forward movement, to turn around for battle and prepare to attack Dudino and Rusino. However, at this time one of the units of Brave suddenly and strongly hit the tail of the column. In the rear of the Germans began to panic. One part of the soldiers turned to flee in the direction of Chehachevo. The other retreated from the road to the west and was met by fire from Sedov's detachment. And all this immediately affected the actions of the vanguard units of the enemy, which were forced to withdraw from the battle for Dudino and Rusino and move to save their rear. But by the time they were able to restore order and launch a counterattack, it lost all meaning. Our men withdrew into the woods, and for a while lay low. The Nazis attacked the void. An attempt was made to make a flank attack from the direction of Plotoverts, but it was repulsed by a strong barrier of Sedov's detachment. So we fought the whole day. By the end of it, convinced that the infantry alone could not cope with us, the Punishers called 8 tanks and 3 armoured cars to support them. They lost 2 tanks and an armoured car, but still managed to capture one village, Dudino. Their losses in manpower amounted to about 300 men. At night, together with the squad commanders, we conducted a detailed review of the past fighting. In general, the squads coped with the task successfully. It is no coincidence that the enemy, who had such a large force and received tank support, was able to occupy only one village. Still, we fought not flawlessly, and in the detachment Brave there was even an emergency. So the commander of Brave tried to deceive the regimental headquarters, reporting that his CP is in the place that was due to the order, but located in fact almost 2 kilometers to the side, away from the battle, but in complete safety. The detachment was thus deprived of operational leadership, and its actions were much less effective than we had hoped. I regarded the actions of this commander as criminal, removed him from the leadership, demoted him to private and sent him to the command of the brigade. Lieutenant Alexei Vladimirovich Alexeyev, the former chief of staff, took over the unit, and Alexander Fedorovich Karmalev took his place. We worked out a plan of military operations for the next day and were able to rest until morning. At night, Hitlerites never disturbed us. In this sense, they were a convenient enemy necessary to our expectations. The next day, the Germans did not start fighting. Either they were waiting for reinforcements, or they were reconnoitering and adjusting the plan of attack. Only on May 13 they attacked the village of Nikolskoye. This time I watched their actions from the command post of the detachment Brave, located in the bushes near the village. From here I could see the battlefield perfectly. The Punishers, as a rule, built their offensive tactics according to one barbarously simple scheme. They did not depart from it this time. Approaching the attacked village about a kilometer away, they rolled out their guns and opened fire on the roofs of the houses. At that time, houses in the Pskov region were usually roofed with thatch, and it was very easy to set fire to them. The village began to burn. It became impossible to stay in it, and the pre-prepared nearby firing points were also unusable. At that time, tanks accompanied by several chains of infantry entered the battle. The Punishers were not interested in the villages themselves. They wanted to clear the territory of partisans and what was left on it. They did not care, and it was not the settlements that fell into their hands, but the ashes abandoned by the population, in which, like monuments on the graves, the stoves and stovepipes stood out, and the coal, ashes, and the remains of burnt goods were like grave mounds. What could we oppose the enemy when the whole artillery of the regiment consisted of one small-caliber gun, without a sight, and one capricious anti-tank gun? So far only the same approximate actions as on the first day. When the Hitlerites moved to Nikolskoye, on their rear in the area of Dudino made a strong blow to the detachment Brave. From Alexeyev's command post it was visible how the head unit's reaction. The cannon fire on Nikolskoye was suspended. The guns were deployed and began to shell the forest on the eastern side. By this time the Brave had already withdrawn from the battle, but the enemy, unaware of this, kept firing for quite a long time. Then the guns again turned towards Nikolskoye, but this time the shelling was short-lived. From the thickets now from the western side, a detachment for the motherland struck the flank of the advancing troops, and again the movement paused. Again the guns were deployed. Finally, tanks were introduced into the offensive, but another surprise awaited them. 2 vehicles almost immediately exploded on mines, very successfully put at night by the Sedov detachment bombers, and at once partisan machine guns started talking from the flanks. And so the Punishers were on the spot almost all that day. Only in the evening, having razed Nikolskoye to the ground with artillery fire, they managed to conduct a successful attack with the remaining tanks and take the village. But with the onset of darkness, one of Latvian detachments, supported by the detachment for the motherland, repulsed Nikolsko, and Hitlerites were forced to retreat to Dudino. On May 13, they lost another 100 men and 2 tanks. On the 4th day, the enemy started fighting somewhat later than usual, moved to Nikolsko extremely cautiously, and tank support to the infantry had already grown to 9 vehicles. Our only gun was a rather psychological weapon. I have already said that it had no sights and had to be aimed through the barrel. It is clear that in this way to hit a moving target is almost impossible, and our shells did not harm the tanks, and this time the enemy managed to disarm the mined areas. Apparently, that's why the offensive started later than always. This day was not going well for the regiment. We suffered very heavy losses, and by the end of the day retreated to Bolshaya Zapolya. It became known that on May 13 Hitlerites started an offensive on the northern border of the Partisan region, 35-40 kilometers from us. They managed to occupy the villages of Sosnitsy, Krutets, Stanki, Baranovka, and continued to push the guerrillas to the village of Tuchino. The situation required us to act decisively. We had to find a way to change the course of the fighting. We had to find strength in the exhausted regiment in order to stop the enemy, who began to act more successfully than we did. But where was this way, and where would the strength come from? We found a way out after all. I have already written about the fact that the Nazis fought extremely pedantic. During the day, battle; at night, rest. We decided to break this scheme. The regiment went to action by the tried and tested partisan method. Night. We decided to fight in 2 shifts. Each detachment was divided into 2 unequal parts, one of which, smaller but sufficiently heavily armed, fought at night and rested during the day, while the other acted vice versa. However, by the night of May 14-15, all units had not yet managed to switch to such an order, but the detachment for the motherland, less exhausted by the daytime fighting than others, went out in full force for the night operation. The reorganization of our tactics was also caused by the fact that the nature of the terrain between Belkova and Bolshaya Zapolya made it difficult to conduct flank and rear attacks, thus depriving us of the opportunity to act in a favorable way. The organization of night raids more than paid for all this. So on the night of May 15, the detachment for the motherland went on a mission. Before it was not set the task to repel the enemy occupied the previous day's settlements. It was not only to stage an attack, it was necessary to force the enemy to conduct a night defensive battle and wear him out. With the onset of darkness on the Punishers, stationed in Belkova and Nikolsky, from the bushes adjacent to the villages came a sudden and heavy fire. The reaction is difficult to describe. The machine defended with all available firepower. Machine guns and automatic rifles crackled, automatic and tank guns and mortars were beating. Flares flew one after another, dispersing the night gloom over the area. From the outside, it could seem that there was a bloody, heavy, and persistent battle. But in reality, there was no battle. Having drawn enemy fire, the detachment stealthily withdrew and settled in a safe place, waiting. For about 2 hours, the Punishers could not calm down. At last, the fire gradually subsided and soon stopped. But in about 30 minutes, the squad again shelled the villages, only now playing the attack from the other side, and everything was exactly the same. So it went on all night, and the main forces of our regiment were sleeping peacefully at this time. When the new day began, there was no active fighting on the part of the enemy. The reason, of course, was the night spent without sleep, and in constant tension. Our detachments did not give the Punishers any rest during the daytime, attacking them now and then or simply shelling them from all convenient positions. Especially alarming for the enemy situation was created in the area of Dudino and Druzino, that is, in the rear of the expedition, and so it continued now until the very end of the fighting. On this day, we received a message from the brigade headquarters that N.P. Buenov's brigade was moving into our immediate neighborhood, which would counteract the Punishers on our right flank. Already at night, the brigade occupied its site, and our loneliness was On May 16, we fought hard for Bolshu Zapoli. Hitlerites acted with their usual method. They set fire to the village with artillery fire, and then moved forward tanks, which attacked us this time from 2 directions, 12 vehicles from Belkova and 4 from Plotovets. In addition, the Punishers were supported by aviation. This battle was similar to the previous ones in its character and tactics, so I will not describe it in detail. I will only give an excerpt from the article Spring Blows, published in the partisan newspaper People's Avenger. All partisan hatred and power fell on the enemy in the May-spring days. The enemy tried to break our resistance. On May 16, he threw on the village 3.16 tanks, an armoured car and 1,000 soldiers. But the steadfastness of the partisans proved stronger than the technique. Gradually running out of breath, the Nazis were ending the expedition. It about resistance, which they met, can be judged by the example of at least our section of defence. Having undeniable superiority and in equipment, and in weapons and in manpower, the Punishers were moving forward at a truly snail's pace, 1.52 kilometres a day. What did they achieve as a result? In fact, nothing. Despite the fact that during the fighting they managed to seize many villages on the highway Chikachevo, Staraya Russa. The fact is that the capture of settlements did not solve anything. It was still impossible to use the road. In the monograph Partisan Movement in the Leningrad region, we read, at the cost of enormous efforts, Hitlerites still managed in the second half of May to squeeze the partisans and seize the road Chikachevo, Staraya Russa, but they could not use it unhindered. Partisans in small groups infiltrated the road, mined it, attacked the enemy columns heading to the front to Staraya Russa. In total, in May, partisans of the region conducted about 100 fights, in which Hitlerites lost more than 2,000 soldiers and officers, 16 tanks and 2 armoured cars. So ingloriously ended the second punitive expedition against the partisan region. Having decided at first that victory was on their side, the occupiers soon became convinced of the absolute absurdity of such a conclusion. In placing their garrisons in the burned villages along the road, they achieved only one thing. They created close and extremely convenient targets for guerrilla strikes. Very eloquently testifies to this one of the letters captured by the partisans in those days, non-commissioned officer Ernst to his family. You cannot imagine our situation. From 9 p.m. to 8 a.m., no one is allowed to sleep in his hole to prevent a possible partisan raid. Speaking frankly and openly, this condition could end in madness. The small village of Green Wedge fully justified its name. The area around it really wedged the green of forests, fields and bushes into the large, rugged swamps spreading to the west. In this village, and settled in the early summer of 1942, the headquarters of our regiment. Dislocation of detachments was extremely advantageous and convenient both for reflection of possible attacks of Hitlerites on partisan edge in the area controlled by the regiment, and for observation of garrisons of the enemy, for the organization of attack. A close proximity to the detachment brave, occupying our right flank, was still the zone of action of the 1st OB. During this period we fought mainly against the enemy garrisons fortified in the villages on the highway Chikachevo, the Staraya Russa. In the settlements themselves and on the approaches to them, the occupants created quite strong fortified positions with strong long-term fire struck. We switched to rather simple and at the same time quite effective methods of struggle, the variety of which often put Hitlerites in a deadlock. I am telling in detail about the forms and methods of struggle we used, about our tactics, because I consider it very important. It is this can create in the reader the most accurate and complete impression of the guerrilla reality, to help him see the real picture of the struggle that went in the enemy rear. After all, what a sin to say. After the passage of years, this picture in some of its part has become embellished, came from somewhere gilded, born and exaggerations. But they are hardly justified. The feat of the Soviet people during the Great Patriotic War in any part of the battle against fascism is so great that it does not need pink colours. One should strive to tell as accurately as possible about what actually happened, and only about that. Ridiculous are the claims of other Western historians that Hitler's army simply bogged down in the vastness of Russia, or that it was General Moroz who defeated it. However, no less far from the truth and ideas about the victory as a consequence of a single factor: higher morale, will and fortitude of one of the warring parties. The war is won by the country that has many inherent advantages in its system: economic, military, ideological, and in local battles. The winner was not the one who simply shouted hurrah more loudly. The moral factor is important, but it is not the only one. We had to be able to use the forms and methods of struggle at our disposal to be able to build our tactics correctly. We were fighting with an experienced, strong enemy, and it was not easy to defeat him. I wrote at the same time that Hitler's units usually surpassed us in numbers, armament, and technical equipment, and that direct single combat with them was therefore often beyond our capabilities. But we searched and found new forms of struggle, diversified tactics, and B1. In the early summer of 1942, we were not limited to the tried and tested means. Actions from ambushes and night raids on enemy garrisons in the area of the highway Chikashevo, Staraya Russa, in partisan detachments and regiments were constantly born new tactics, in methods, in means, simply in the way of using this or that type of weapon. It was around this time that the Hunters movement was born in our regiment, which later became quite widespread throughout the brigade. In each detachment, small groups of 2-3 men were created from among the partisans who were particularly good with small arms. They went out daily to hunt. They looked for the enemy, and when they saw him, they came to a distance of effective fire and hit the target. Partisans disguised themselves from the night on a convenient position near the village occupied by Hitlerites, waited for a convenient moment and opened fire. Those who were good with a hand machine gun were allowed to hunt with this weapon as well. We did not consider ourselves the inventors of the new movement. The very first hunters, that is snipers, appeared not with us, but in army units we learned about them from newspapers. But in the partisan region, the first snipers were the fighters of our regiment, and more precisely, the detachment Brave. Here's how it began. Alexiev, commander of Brave, in one of his visits to the headquarters of the regiment between business tours, Krauts in Kebaradovo are going crazy out of boredom. They have organized a circus for themselves. They go out in the morning to the paddock, 10 or 20 men, and have fun. Horses are having their nuptials, so they gallop around, yelling, shouting, they roar like stallions. It's disgusting to watch. I'd like to kick them. And you, Lyosha, and hit them, advised someone. In short, the idea was born. And the next night, 5 guerrillas from the detachment Brave, having chosen a convenient position, arranged an ambush. In the morning, as usual, the Hitlerites came to the paddock to have fun. This time there were about 40 of them, and almost none of them did not escape from under the fire of machine gun partisan Minakov and hand machine gun partisan Ryazanov. This was the first hunting in the region, and the spread of it can be judged by the political report to the Leningrad headquarters of the guerrilla movement in May 1942, compiled by the commissar and head of the political department of the brigade. A big place took up the issue of popularization of the groups of hunters created in the 1st Regiment. After the punitive expedition was defeated and the Germans moved to the defense, the partisans went in small groups to hunt, only 2 groups from Sedov's detachment, numbering 8 people for 3 days from 23 to 26.6 killed 11 fascists. Now such groups are created and act from all detachments. And further, despite the fact that the enemy buried in the ground and mined, hunters so many that it is necessary to establish a line to go on a trip to, hunting in the rear of the enemy, behind the line of his defense. Partisans have become bolder and more ruthless. If before they shot when approaching the Germans at 300-400 meters, now the hunters let up to 170 meters and hit for shore. On the same days, the brigade's sabotage activities on the railroads intensified. Here we also had to puzzle for a long time, inventing new ways. Hitlerites trying to maximize the safety of the movement also used countermeasures of the most diverse properties, significantly complicating our actions on especially dangerous areas. For example, they cut down on both sides of the railroad bed all the vegetation for more than 100 meters and deprived us of the possibility of a stealthy approach. They reduced the speed of echelons to a minimum. This ensured the least damage in case of sabotage. The echelon would stop, but it would not go under the slope. Between Novosokoniki and No Hitlerites always launched at some distance before the military echelon a steam locomotive with 1 or 2 platforms loaded with stone in front. And if pressure mines were installed under the canvas, they worked uselessly, destroying these platforms. So we started using guided mines. At night a charge was laid under the canvas, from which a long cord, the so-called fishing line, was pulled to the shelter where the bombers were disguised. Everything else was simple. A steam locomotive with ballast-loaded platforms was skipped, and when the train itself appeared, the fuse was detonated exactly under its locomotive. There were several charges, exploding them simultaneously under the locomotive and 2 or 3 cars. In addition, on the railroads we began to arrange ordinary ambushes. A large group of partisans, having chosen the most convenient place at night, shot the train on the move. By this time, a lot of weapons had been transferred to the Partisan region: machine guns, mortars, anti-tank guns, rifles with telescopic sights. From anti-tank guns, our fighters fired at steam locomotives, causing them serious damage. Rifles with telescopic sights, of course, were given to the best hunters. The success of our actions was due in many ways, and the closest connection established between the guerrillas and the inhabitants of the region. Here is just one example. For the first 9 months of the Partisan region, only in the territory controlled by the Didovici Orgtroikal, local residents were prepared for the Partisan detachments, 8,730 quintals of various agricultural products, including grain 3,370 quintals, potatoes 180, forage 1,500, meat 600, vegetables 80 quintals, milk 200,000 litres, eggs 30,000 pieces. Sective farmers collected and handed over to partisans 560 fur coats, 700 sheepskins, 740 pairs of veilinox, more than 1,000 pairs of underwear, more than 2,000 pairs of warm socks and gloves, more than 1,500 meters of canvas. In addition, by the new year, by the 24th anniversary of the Red Army, and by May 1, they prepared more than 2,000 individual gifts for us. One of the organizers of this huge work was a wonderful woman, the deputy chairman of the Didovici Organizing Committee, Ekaterina Martinovna Petrova. Everyone who had to face her in those days forever remembered her energy, optimism, devotion to the common cause, and also an amazing charm that found its way to the hearts of every collective farmer and collective farmer, every partisan and partisan woman. By the thoughts, will, and deeds of people like her, the Partisan region was fused into a single, formidable force for the enemy. It's been 2 months since I took the 1st Regiment, but it is not without reason that in war a year counts for 3. It seemed to me that I had been here for a long time. I liked my regiment very much. It seemed to me a big, united organism, well coordinated, strong, and intelligent. I felt myself a part of it and was happy about it. Captain Tushin in Tolstoy's War and Peace saw himself in a combat position as a giant easily throwing cannonballs at the enemy. I felt something similar, only I imagined our whole regiment as a giant, and this giant stretched out his hand from the forest to the railroad and threw down the enemy train, knocked down the cars from the Chikechev highway, crushed, like mosquitoes, thousands of soldiers in the hated uniform of the Wehrmacht. I wanted our regiment to be the best and for everyone to know about it. It was a feeling similar to the one feels for one's own child, often excessive, often biased, but almost always fruitful. The wonderful people who surrounded me will never leave my memory. Commissar Alexander Ivanovich Kazakov, Chief of Staff Mikhail Viktorovich Stepanov, Commissioner of the Special Department Alexei Ivanovich Pushkin, Commander of the Detachment Alexei Vladimirovich Alexeev, Commander of the Belebelkovsky Detachment Nikolai Nikolaevich Sedov, Commander of the For the Motherland Detachment, Secretary of the Ashevsky District Party Committee Mikhail Alexandrovich Kuprianov, Regimental Dr. Alexey Ivanovich Ivanov, my Deputy in Intelligence Alexander Alexeyevich Valentsev, Commander of the Detachment Georgy Matveyevich Ravlev, Commanders and Political Instructors of Companies and Platoons Ivan Nikitich Elvov, Boris Nikolaevich Titov, Vasily Pavlovich Plokoy, Ivan Ananyevich Smekalov L.F. How can you list them all? With their help, they managed to create a remarkably healthy climate in the regiment, which excluded all kinds of rambling and indiscipline, so-called partisanship, licentiousness and liberty, but at the same time brought people something much more than just strict discipline. It was a conscious discipline, justified, deeply understood by everyone, and it was built not on declarations, but on the personal example of commanders who never caught a piece of fat from the common pot, who never considered themselves people from a special dough, and quite naturally lived the same life with their soldiers. Healthy relationships always depend on the leader. They are also one of his most important tasks, given that only a healthy team is able to really well solve the tasks set before it. It is the ability of my comrades to create around them the atmosphere of real life, devoid of any falsehood and far-fetchedness, has forever left in my heart of gratitude and the deepest respect for them. We worked very well together. I don't remember a case when disagreements on some issues that arose quite naturally, as in any business, affected our relationship. We did not make a tragedy out of other people's mistakes. and therefore we knew how to admit our own, even though it was hard. We knew how to consult. But at the same time, we knew that the commander was solely responsible for everything that happened in his unit. We believed in the power of collective intelligence, but we also knew that the formula "mind is good, but two are better" is not universal. In combat, it is often simply unsuitable, because there is no time to consult. Here, the commander decides on his own. At the head of the regiment stood very different people, purely civilian and military, who by the beginning of the war had combat experience and never smelled gunpowder, very young and already elderly. But the war brought us together and we became similar. Attitude to the business, love for the people entrusted to us, hatred of the enemy. Over time, the staff established such mutual understanding that now it is difficult for me to remember where our opinions could diverge. We were always united in the assessment of fundamental issues. I remember that for sure, but the little things, that's why they are called so. That's why they are forgotten, because they do not play a role. Alexander Ivanovich Kazakov was in the past, as I have already written, a party worker, the secretary of the Utogoshki District Party Committee. He was a man of calm, restrained, benevolent. Never flaunted his eye, quickly recognized, if it happened, his mistakes. He did not linger in the headquarters. More often he could be found in the detachments among the partisans, who liked to talk to him and very much respected. And he also had a sniff or something on the initiative which was worth supporting. In this, probably, the experience of a party worker had an impact. Alexander Ivanovich is no longer alive. The chief of staff of the regiment, Mikhail Viktorovich Stepanov, is not alive either. But it seems to me that I am not the only one who will long remember this man. Intelligent, ingenuous, sociable, full of optimism and confidently looking forward to the future. Mikhail Viktorovich was a cadre military man. He graduated from the Leningrad Franz Voso School, where he was sent on a Komsomol ticket, having a high school and work as a steam locomotive stoker. His military specialty was also railroad. When the German troops broke through our defences at the Luga frontier, Stepanov was in one of the Partisan detachments, soon became its commander, and then chief of staff of the regiment. In early 1943, when I, wounded, was evacuated to the Soviet rear, he headed the regiment, and then became commander of the 1st Brigade. The commissioner of the special department of the regiment, Alexei Ivanovich Pushkin, least of all looked outwardly like a counterintelligence officer. For example, it seemed to me that he was more like a school teacher, intelligent, caring, disposable, and arousing complete trust. From the very first minute of meeting him, it was clear to everyone, I think, that this man was able to understand everything. He was unhurried, but not slow. Thoughtful. He did everything thoroughly and always brought everything he started to the end. His patience could only be envied, and with all this, Alexei Ivanovich was characterized by a firm character and enviable courage. Not reckless, but reasonable and never even in seemingly hopeless situations. I never had to see him confused. In a word, he was an excellent man, a firm leader, a loyal and faithful comrade. The commander of the detachment, brave Alexei Vladimirovich Alexeyev, was younger than us. He was only 26 years old. On May 5, 1941, he graduated from the Stalingrad Military School of Communications. On June 20 or 21, he left with his military unit for exercises to the western border. On the way, he learned about the war. In the area of Devinsk, commanding a platoon of communications, Alexeyev was wounded and was hospitalized. After recovery, he was appointed head of telegraph station in the 32nd Army, was surrounded near Vyazma. Wandering through the rear of the enemy in December of the 41st, came out in the area of Podoraya in the Partisan region, and became a platoon commander of the detachment Brave. Later he became chief of staff of the detachment, then its commander, and even later in 1943, commander of the 7th Brigade. Alexeyev's detachment was one of the best in the regiment. In June 1942, he earned a high award, a transient pennant of the Central Committee of the Komsomol. The commander of the Belebelkovsky detachment, Nikolai Nikolaevich Sedov, former secretary of the Belebelkovsky District Party Committee, was a purely civilian man, but time forced him to study military science, being behind enemy lines since the fall of 1941. He became a competent, knowledgeable partisan commander. For some reason it is not customary, speaking of a good commander, to recall his mistakes. I think this is wrong. Mistakes cannot diminish merit. So Sedov was just that commander, who, not knowing how to use a compass and a map, got lost with the detachment during our raid on the garrison in Veriagi. In those days, about which I am telling you now, Sadov had perfectly conducted operations in the villages of Ruchi and Cheremshah, and his detachment acted very competently during the battles against the Second Punitive Expedition. Sadov, like Alexeyev, was considered one of the best commanders. Later he became commissar of the 2nd Regiment in the famous 3rd Brigade of a V German. Detachments brave and for the motherland were leaders of the brigade unfolded in the socialist competition, in which all regiments and detachments participated. And let the reader not be surprised by this word. Socialist competition passed with us from the days of peace to the days of war. Just as before the war, it helped our movement forward, gave birth to initiative, the spirit of healthy competition, and, as a consequence, life in the partisan region at that time was very turbulent. On the Shikachev highway, Hitlerites felt themselves as driven beasts. They burrowed into the ground, hid behind the walls of defensive constructions, and for a long time did not try to poke their noses out of there. According to reports from hunters and observation posts, not only harmonica sounds, not only laughter, but even loud speech were no longer heard from the garrisons. The occupants were now afraid of every bush because, they said, the bushes shoot here too. In the ranks of the guerrillas, on the contrary, reigned the highest morale. The success of combat operations gave a strong confidence in their abilities. A stable connection with the Soviet rear, regularly received newspapers from there and letters from relatives did not give room for feelings of detachment from their own. The medical service was also well organized, which now ensured the delivery of the seriously wounded to hospitals behind the front line and treatment of the lightly wounded here in hospitals in the territory of the region. The constant care of the inhabitants of the region, who provided us with everything we needed, could not but influence the morale of the people.